Good afternoon. My name is Christina Matruzek, and I'm the secretary of the IFLA Library Theory and Research section, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers and to coordinate this session. The session is focused on digital technology and access, and we have three presentations that explore the issue of convergence actually in three different areas. One is the use of standards and application of one of the standards, which is European Educational Framework, and looking at the areas of convergence in knowledge, skills, and abilities for librarians and archivists. The second presentation is looking at the issues of convergence in the area of big data research. And the last one is looking at linked open data in libraries, archives, and museums. We actually changed the order of presentation, so it is slightly different than you have in the program. We'll start with the presentation by Giovanni Michetti, and then Bob Pym will be our second speaker. So please let me introduce Giovanni Michetti, who will be our first speaker. Giovanni Michetti is currently an assistant professor of archival science at the University of Rome. He used to be a professor of library and archival information science at University of British Columbia. So his new position in Rome is quite recent. He taught for several years in the areas of records management, archival description, and digital preservation, and also was involved in several international initiatives focused on digital preservation. He's also a member of Italian representation in the ISO working groups on records management. He co-authored several articles and essays in scholarly journals, and is also an author of Italian translation of EAD encoded archival description and open archival information systems, the two important standards in archival description and in digital preservation. So, please, Giovanni.
Thank you very much for the presentation. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to speak at this interesting meeting. I do believe there is a growing need for spaces where information professionals may meet, discuss, and possibly share concepts, initiatives, and problems. Today, I will talk about two brand new Italian standards on professional profiles and how they may be such a space where convergence of librarians and archivists may be discussed. You will find the complete speech online, so I will cut the less relevant parts here. The European Parliament and Council established in 2008 the European Qualifications Framework, EQF, for lifelong learning, a reference model to support improvement of education and training systems. The European Act recommends using the European Qualifications Framework as a reference tool to compare the qualification levels of different qualification systems, to promote lifelong learning and equal opportunities, and promote further integration of the European labour market while respecting the rich diversity of national education systems. The architecture of the EQF is very simple. It is based on the triad knowledge, skill, and competence, which are considered as the fundamental learning outcomes through which any professional profile may be identified. Knowledge is defined in the EQF as a body of facts, principles, theories, and practices that is related to a field of work or study. It is the outcome of the assimilation of information through learning, the result of an interaction between intelligence, which is capacity to learn, and situation, which is opportunity to learn. Skill is defined in the EQF as the ability to apply knowledge and use know-how to complete tasks and solve problems. It may be cognitive or practical. There is a thin line between knowledge and skills. It is difficult to regard cognitive competencies as knowledge rather than skill. This is particularly evident when we turn to the library information science domain, since we cannot establish clear boundaries between these two categories. The library and information science professions are a complex mix of practical skills and theoretical competencies. Competence is the proven ability to use knowledge, skills, and personal, social, and/or methodological abilities in work or study situations and in professional and personal development. Competence can be described in terms of responsibility and autonomy. The European initiative has been an opportunity to reconsider archival and library activities under a different light. This consideration was one of the fundamental drivers of an Italian initiative launched in 2012, grounded upon the EQF model and aimed at developing a national standard to define the qualifying features of the archivist. The initiative was promoted by the Italian Standards Organization, UNI, Ente Nazionale Italiano di Unificazione, and led eventually to the issue of two national standards, UNI 11535 and UNI 11536, defining the requirements in terms of knowledge, skills, and competencies to be, respectively, a librarian or an archivist. These standards may improve social and professional identification of archivists and librarians as proactive actors not only within their specific domain, but also in the broader societal context, in their fundamental role of managers and preservers of cultural heritage, supporting local communities and societies at large in their ongoing action of self-definition. The standards may also improve education processes at graduate and postgraduate level. Knowledge, skills, and competencies defined in the standards may be adopted as a criterion or a guide to design a coherent and comprehensive educational program. Let's focus first on the standard on the archivist's profile. Its core is a scheme where functions, activities, competencies, skills, and knowledge are organized in a systematic way. The philosophy that drove the development of the standard may well be expressed using the words of Richard Pierce Moses. What information professionals do in the digital era remains the same. They must still work with records creators and publishers to build the collection, manage the organization of the materials, their preparation for use and their preservation, and they must work with the public and other users to provide access to the collections. None of that changes in the digital era. However, how information professionals do their jobs will change. In other words, the standard has been developed assuming that the fundamental functions and activities of archival professions have not changed. This can be clearly seen from the very first level of the scheme, which identifies the threefold mission of the archivist: manage archives through their life, communicate archives, and manage and run archival services. Each mission is then structured into functions as depicted in the table. So you can see that manage archives through their life is structured into records management, protection, appraisal and disposition, arrangement and description, preservation, and so on. The standard provides a brief description of each function. So you can see that, for example, records management is the whole of the activities aimed at governing creation, maintenance, handling, use, and disposition of records. I'm sorry, you can read it very well, but it's almost impossible to make it in one slide. And preservation, for example, is the whole of the activities aimed at preserving documentary systems and objects along with their relationships in such a way that their significant properties are not altered. All these functions are considered pertinent to the archival profile, and altogether they shape the professional identity of an archivist. But not every archivist is supposed to perform them all in their daily activity. Rather, specialization is encouraged. Each archival function is articulated into activities. So, for example, records management encompasses design of records management systems and record keeping. Preservation encompasses management of environment and curation and preservation of archival materials. The triad knowledge, skills, and competencies proposed by the European model is implemented at this level onto each of the archival activities identified in the table. So, for example, let's take the activity description. It refers to all the activities aimed at collecting, analyzing, organizing, and recording information that supports identification, management, location, and illustration of archival material, along with its context of production, use, transmission, and preservation. Okay, we can skip it. The standard on the librarian's profile has a similar structure, even if less articulated and detailed. First, the mission of librarians is identified and described as a set of different areas of action, and then 9 different activities related to each area or specific mission are identified, and they are, as you can see, planning and development of collections, handling and organization of documents, documents description and indexing and data production, preservation and protection of documents, and so on, as you can read. Then, each activity is divided up into competencies, as depicted in the table. So, for example, planning and development of collection is divided up into plan accession, select resources, and manage accession processes, etc. So here we need 2 slides to describe all the activities for the librarians. Following the EQF model, each competence has skills and knowledge associated. So, for example, documents description and indexing and data production is at the core of the librarian's work and has 5 different competencies associated, each with its specific skills. So you can see, for example, that generate data related to documents is associated to different skills like apply cataloging rules and bibliographic standards, assign persistent identifiers, use bibliographic indexes and catalogs, and establish relationships among the data elements created. And the knowledge associated to this activity is foundations of library science, cataloging principles and techniques, and so on. Apparently, the librarian's activities, competencies, and skills are quite different from those outlined in the standard for archivists, and this is in line with the need of defining 2 professional figures with their specific features and peculiarities. Librarians and archivists have developed a long time their own communities, languages, disciplines. In other words, they have shaped their professional figures, seeking for an autonomous space in the realm of the library information science domain. However, it is also true that new technologies have somehow determined an inversion of this process. Books and records are totally different objects, with different nature, functions, and characteristics. But in digital environment, they often need similar treatments. In principle, preserving an electronic resource in a library is not that different from preserving a digital record in an archives. Defining a metadata set is a fundamental activity that must be performed in both the library and the archival domain. The differences are in the content rather than in the methodology. The same is true for the design, management, or evaluation of an information system. Not to talk about non-core activities like management of human resources or strategic planning. The 2 Italian standards reflect such duplicity. They look different on the surface, but once we scratch it, we can see many elements in common. In order to compare their architectures, it is better to focus on the high levels and, putting aside the specific titles, you cannot read it very well, don't worry, I'm going to talk over the slide, consider the deep meaning of the activities outlined, trying to get the gist of them. First of all, it should be noted that both standards list their high-level activities trying to follow a sort of chronological order, following resources from creation to preservation stage. Therefore, in the archival standard, we will find records management, appraisal and disposition, arrangement and description, and preservation, followed by other activities that can be considered as cross activities, since they can be performed at any stage. For example, user services, promotion, management, and administration. The standard for librarians follows a similar approach. There is a planning stage, entry number 1, then documents are handled and organized, then described, indexed, and associated to their metadata, and eventually preserved. Some cross activities complete the list. So, for example, you can find accession and management of equipment, management of human resources, etc. Seeking for convergence between archives and library, such similarity is comforting. A closer look at the schemes suggests that some matches can be easily established. Documents description and indexing and data production in the library scheme is essentially about describing resources following a set of given criteria, producing data accordingly, and monitoring the quality of data. This is very much what archivists do in their description activity. Preservation and protection in the library scheme, Preservation and protection in the library scheme is easily matched to archival preservation. Accession and management of equipment, tools, and information systems in the library scheme can be matched to management of facilities and tools in the archival scheme. User services and outreach merges two archival activities, user services and promotion, training, and education. Management of human resources, financial resources, and property in the library scheme matches very well some inner entries of management and administration in the archival scheme. Research in the library and information science domain in the library scheme matches research in the archival scheme. The matches for the other first-level entries of the librarian's scheme are a bit more complicated. So, for example, planning and development of collections in the library scheme is a bit problematic. Given its position at the top of the structure, one is tempted to consider it as the first stage of the collection life cycle and match it to the archival entry records management, which refers to the management of archival resources. However, plan accession, which is nested within planning and development in the librarian's scheme, refers to a planning activity that should rather be matched to management of archival holdings in the archival scheme. On the other hand, manage accession process, still nested within planning and development, may be considered as a management activity pertaining to the initial stage of the life cycle, so it can be matched to the archival record keeping. In brief, planning and development of collection, the first level entry in the library scheme, is a candidate for matching records management in the archival scheme. However, the critical issue is to decide whether strategic planning is an activity that should be considered as part of the very practical management activity, or it deserves an autonomous space within management and administration, or elsewhere. A second example. Handling and organization of documents is another example of a problematic entry. In fact, organized documents for flow can be matched to the archival entry designing the records management system, which embeds a specific skill called organizing workflow. The same is true for the entry manage documents handling and organization, which can be matched to record keeping. The critical issue is organized shelving and storage systems, since it poses an interesting problem. As you can see, this entry is nested within handling and organization of documents. That is, it refers to the active stage. There is no doubt that resources need to be physically allocated and arranged in order to be managed. However, it can be found no similar entry within records management, because in the archivist scheme, function prevails against time. Shelving and storing are considered as preservation actions. Therefore, preservation is the entry dealing with them in the archivist scheme. It is there that we should look to establish a match. In other words, preservation is a function that needs to be implemented at any stage of the life cycle, and so do many of its related activities, including shelving and storing. That's why they are kept under the preservation umbrella in the archivist scheme. It's the functional approach, while librarians give more relevance to the sequence of actions performed in order to manage library resources. I may call this a sort of procedural, chronological approach. This is no big problem, since a match can be established anyway, but it is an interesting issue that should be investigated in order to both improve internal consistency of each scheme and support their convergence. Similar issues raised with other entries. Summarizing, the comparison between the two standards, rather the two schemes, shows that there is a lot of room for designing a convergent model that may be applied to both archivists and librarians. There are some peculiarities that cannot and must not be eliminated. Some first-level entries in one scheme match deeper-level entries in the other scheme. Some entries seem to match perfectly, but their nested entries do not match at all. In brief, the road to convergence is not easy nor short. However, even from this very superficial analysis, it emerges a common structure that is worth of investigation. So here you can read, there are some fundamental functions performed by any library, archives, and museum professional, because they all manage resources, they describe resources, they preserve resources. And also you have some the same function like user services, design and appraisal of information systems and applications, outreach, training and education, research and management and administration of an institution. This is just a rough scheme and a starting point. I am aware that issues are going to arise as soon as archivists and librarians and museum professionals try to design a shared set of second-level entries. However, this is an opportunity that should not be wasted. This is not about standardization. Rather than a goal, standards here can be a means, a leverage to promote integration. Different actors in the same arena may cooperate in order to create a consistent and integrated framework where different professional figures may act being aware of each one's competencies. Education and training systems, as well as the market, would benefit from such an integrated and consistent approach. Promoting integration starting from a standardization process has a big advantage. Stakeholders must accept to lose a bit of their specificity in favor of shared and common benefits. This is a fundamental feature of any standardization process, a methodological approach that forces stakeholders to clarify what their goals are and what limit they can push their expectations. Too often, different actors are not aware that sharing, integrating, creating a common space comes with a cost. The standardization action sheds light on these hidden or ambiguous aspects. On the other hand, it must be highlighted that standards are not enough to realize convergence. They should be the outcome of a community action, a participated effort supported by stakeholders. Therefore, standards should be taken as an opportunity rather than rigid tools to force integration. And then the last slide. Standards are indeed valuable as technical tools per se, but their fundamental value lies rather in their capacity to raise awareness and issues and bring community to discussion. Standards are a way by which a community identifies itself. In other words, there is no guarantee that convergence can be realized and a common standard can be designed, but the effort of trying is worth it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your informative and very engaging presentation. I think we have time for one question.
I'm Takashi Koga from Tenny University, Japan. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. One very simple question. What about the standard for museum curators in Italy?
Well, I'm an archivist, but anyway, I can talk about. I can say that there is no, I believe, no national standards for national. I mean, I'm talking from the Italian Standards Organization point of view. There is no standard for museum curators. As I said before, the standard I presented today are the first national standards. When I say standard, I mean technical standards issued by some authorized authority, which is the Italian Standards Organization. Of course, there are some, I guess, de facto standards in the museum domain, but there is, I believe, no national standards for the museum domain. But anyway, let me also add that these standards, I mean, this effort, this cooperative action may be an opportunity for them too, because I believe that, as I showed before, maybe this may be a first level that even professionals from the museum domain may adopt. I'm not an expert. I know very little about the museum domain, but I guess the fundamental functions may fit their profession. And then we may specialize, of course, our different activities and functions. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. Bob. The second presentation is by Bob Pym and a number of his colleagues from Charles Sturt University in Australia. Bob Pym is a senior lecturer and associate head of the School of Information Studies at Charles Sturt University in Australia. He coordinates a specialist online postgraduate course in audiovisual archiving and teaches in the areas of collection development and preservation, both in traditional materials and digital objects. He's also a member of the Australian Memory and the World Committee and has research interest in the role of home movies and video as a key part of our cultural heritage. Bob will present a paper on big data where he and his co-authors explore opportunities and barriers across the cultural heritage.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for hanging around, staying to the late afternoon. First of all, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues who, coming from Australia, our university doesn't usually allow more than one person to come, or you can come as long as you pay. So yes, there's just one of us here. My talk would actually take on from, I think, the theme that we've had today, where convergence looks like it is possible. Giovanni was just talking about the close connections between the librarians and archivists standard. And if that's so in the physical analog world, then how much more so in the digital world where, as he pointed out, a file is a file is a file. So whether it's an e-book, whether it's a record that's been created in the government office, whether it's a website, whether it's a sound recording these days, or whether it's a feature film, some files are more complicated than others, but basically they're just digital objects. And so their management, long-term preservation, and all the rest of it, there's a lot of crossover there, a lot of potential, I believe, for convergence in dealing with those sorts of issues. But today we're going to talk a little bit about big data because I think, I'm not sure about you, but for me this is a term that only came up a couple of years ago. All of a sudden it seems to have popped onto our radar and it's everywhere. Everybody's talking about it. We think about, I think that's the wrong slide. Sorry about that. Right. Hang on a minute. Okay. It is on timer, is it? Hello, me. Can we stop that? I'm not a timer sort of person. No, well, okay. Well, I suppose I'll do as the slides say. Right. I'll stop. I'll concentrate on the slides. Tell me when they change. Oh, God. Right. Okay. So we've seen an explosion in the amount of data out there, haven't we? Particularly over the last couple of decades. So governments and business are creating massive amounts of data that never existed. Oh, for goodness sake.
I think you can turn it off, actually.
Hang on.
If you go under format.
Formato. Presentation, probably. Can anybody speak Italian? Yeah. Thank you, John.
I don't know.
It's under presentation.
Under presentation.
Yeah, just turn off the automatic.
That's fine. It wasn't.
I don't know where is it.
Wasn't doing it for you, was it?
I don't know. Where is it? The animazione, trascrizione. Non so qual è il campo della automaticamente.
Automatic.
This is not. Okay.
Thank you.
So let's see. Where is it?
There we go. Thanks. Right.
One,
Okay.
2, 3. Okay.
Thank you. Right, the technology works. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know about this explosion in data, but I'll just give a couple of figures that I put in the paper. So the Library of Congress is... Well, I'm not touching it. How about we just leave it like that, because then it's not in presentation form, and it shouldn't do that. No, okay, fine, right, okay. So I just thought I'd give you some figures, just in case you haven't come across these in recent times. So the Library of Congress is archiving 500 million tweets a day. Now they must have some very big file servers, mustn't they? And after 3 years, their Twitter archive comprised 85 terabytes of data, and that was in 2013, so one assumes it's even bigger now. National libraries in a number of countries do whole-of-domain sweeps of websites, and in Australia, the 2014 trawl of domains ending in .au, which is obviously the Australian domain, resulted in 1 billion files at the National Library, and also it took about 6 weeks to actually gather. So that sort of data, Facebook, YouTube, I'm sure you're all aware of the size of, I've got a vague feeling for those sorts of things. But in addition to that, there's also the increasing, sorry, I should read this. In addition, there's the physical collections being digitised on a large scale. And so the Europeana site, just on the First World War, obviously there was a focus on that, they digitised over 400,000 items. The JFK Library and Museum in the US will have 300 terabytes of data by 2016. So these huge collections are also being complemented by crowdsourced material. That sort of citizen science stuff we talk about where the crowd is creating things. So the crowd's creating social media, yeah, Facebook and YouTube and things, but they're also doing more serious stuff and gathering astronomy data, natural history, that sort of thing. So really big data sets being created by the man in the street, basically, woman in the street. Okay. So the good example of that, and some of you might have come across it, is Galaxy Zoo, which is, or NASA had these thousands, I think millions probably, of photographs of galaxies sent back by one of the Explorer missions, which they had no chance of ever classifying in 10 lifetimes. But they actually set out some fairly straightforward standards and put them out to the American public, in fact to the world, of course, because it's on the web. And the number of people who are actually interested in that sort of stuff is huge. And so in the first year, 50 million classifications were done, which could never have been managed if it was done in-house. But again, of course, it is all more data to manage. Real-time data to do with security, to do with traffic, all those cameras in the street, They're all creating data which has to be managed in some way. I don't think I put that in there. Right. Okay, so which suggests that there's now large numbers of valuable assets that organisations hold, be they government, be they cultural heritage institutions, which require a significant effort to manage and control if they're going to be useful for the organisation and not a drain on costs. And people are going to be able to access and exploit that information. We've got all this information we're gathering. We will need to exploit it and get the best out of it we can. So, let's see if I can change this. So, okay, there are commonalities between all these data sets, and it doesn't matter who's got them or whatever, but also specific domain knowledge required for working with them. But given the limited funding available, one assumes that it is better if we can cooperate across sectors. And if I'm a museum with a very large data set because I've been digitising my poster collection, or I've been capturing 3D images of my physical object collection, then I could reasonably share with an archive that's been digitising its huge collection of records, or a library with its own digitisation program. We could work together, can't we? We can cooperate. Sorry, we don't want to go. Okay. So, characteristics of big data. High volume, high velocity, high variety. So a lot of it comes in enormous amounts, and complete spectrum of stuff, from audio-visual material to short tweets, that sort of stuff, and everything in between. Huge variety. Can originate obviously from a huge variety of sources, and it's often unstructured. It doesn't come with fixed field lengths. It doesn't come nicely catalogued with lots of information. It's just out there. That camera in the street that's recording what's going on is creating lots and lots of data, but no one's controlling that. It's just doing its own thing every 5 seconds or whatever it does. So that really brings up some challenges about management, possibly less so for us in the archival, library and museum worlds, because most of our data is structured, but at the same time, the principles are there that we need to make sure we know how to manage unstructured data as well as structured data. So they talk about low information density, high volume. And particularly for governments, that's an interesting, what's the word? Dilemma, that they've got all this information and they want to be able to exploit it, but there's so much of it. How do you actually get in and pinpoint things? There's issues to do with rights and ownership. So, as I've mentioned before, the web crawl conducted in Australia and in a lot of other countries by their national libraries, we don't have any legal deposit legislation on web crawls, and so that information, the 1 billion files they've got, they actually don't make it available to the public, because at the moment, I believe they're too risk averse. They should just stick it up there like the Internet Archive does and say, go and sue me, or tell me you don't want your stuff available to the public and I'll take it down. But as a government body, they feel they can't do that. So there's issues there. There's issues regarding privacy and security to do with data. The potential to actually move, rehash data, hackathons we call them, to create different data sets where you could actually mesh together individuals and find information. It's one that we have to be aware of. And of course, the capability of IT networks to manage such volumes of material. If we're pushing around huge amounts of data around networks, are our networks good enough to cope with that? So for us, most big data projects rely on government support. And there was a report out a couple of years ago, I'm sure a few of you would have seen it, that estimated the cost of digitising Europe's cultural heritage at around $100 billion, plus an equivalent amount every 10 years to maintain those files over time. So how do we manage that at a time when governments are trying to reduce funding? Governments limit the amount of money available to us. So again, another driver for the need for cooperation, because if government funding is falling down, then we need to be able to get our, more benefit from the small amount we've got. again, sorry about this. I understand my time will be running out. The establishment of peak expert bodies are one way of pulling in the various organisations. So libraries, archives, places like JISC in the UK, which were originally focused on education, now provide services to everybody, whoever needs it. And again, there's smaller focused groupings on specific types, and that's the National Standards Organisation, and Yale also provide lots of online information about how to manage this. We need the leadership from our major professional bodies, and whether they're libraries, whether they're archives, whether they're standards organisations, we need to work together with those people to set up standards and potential processes. We need to identify the key skills, knowledge and attributes required to manage big data. Does it fit in our traditional programs, or is it really a responsibility of IT, information technology programs? And I think that's something we need to worry about a bit, because while we've traditionally delivered some forms of generic skill sets to do with IT and management skills, will that be enough? And I don't think it is, to handle this massive explosion of data. So we need to look at what we can do to change our programs. And this person, Hugh, did some work in the US and suggests that up to 50% of a traditional LIS degree, masters in the US, should be focused heavily on IT. And that's not really disputed, I don't think. The emergence of the iSchool movement in the US and the fact that a lot of us have changed our names. You know, once we were Department of Library Studies, now we're Library and Information Studies. Now a lot of it is Masters of Information or stuff like that. The whole L word is falling away. But how do we fit that into an already crowded curriculum? What do we drop to make room for a much bigger emphasis on IT management? How do we re-engineer courses? How do we find people who can teach on those courses? Because traditionally we haven't put so much emphasis on those fields. And so again, it's an opportunity for collaboration. We need to share expertise. We need to develop jointly appropriate subjects that cross sectors, whether you're teaching archives, whether you're teaching in library, or whether you're teaching in the museum field, because to do with big data, it's all the same. And I think the example there of WISE, which some of you will be familiar with, which is a consortium of US, Australia, New Zealand, and I think UK library schools, where you're allowed to take online subjects that are offered by any of the members. So there's about 20 members of WISE. And again, of course, the digital DIL that somebody mentioned earlier. Again, another cooperative venture. So do we need the emergence of data-focused degrees or specialisations within the broader degree? But what gets dropped are online short courses, and there's a lot out there. There's a thing called the Big Data University I came across that offers lots of courses to do with managing big data. But these courses are run by IT nerds, essentially. These are young lads who've got nothing else to do, and they actually enjoy doing this. And I sound disparaging, I probably am, but at the same time, they are putting their time out there because they've found this an engaging, and an issue that needs to be dealt with. And obviously traditional sources are not meeting that demand. But again, that's an emphasis on the technical and not on the big picture. And I think in our fields, the cultural sector, we've got to keep the perspective, keep the context before we drill down into the technical. So we probably do need to follow that IT-intensive nature, focusing on data management, because we will be facing it, whether we work in libraries, whether we work in archives, whether we work in museums. And so that data management expertise at the moment is less acknowledged, I think. I look at my own course, and we teach a traditional preservation course, which is all about, looking after paper records. It's all about chemical deterioration and sunlight and correct storage. We teach digital preservation as well, but at a rather high level. I don't think anybody could walk out of our course and be able to, get stuck into programming, get stuck into creating, file management software or exploiting existing file management software to actually preserve digital collections. We need to look at that. How do we prepare our students to take up that challenge? So briefly, I think work closely with our professional organisations, because they obviously have a big stake in this. Examine our course and subject offerings, what needs to be fit in. Does relevant material already exist elsewhere? Can we leverage on what IT and business and people like that are doing? Because I know in my school, in my university, The business faculty is very interested in information and how to exploit it and make money out of it, and they're teaching their students how to manage large data sets and things like that. How come we're not delivering that to their schools? It's an interesting one. So we need to look at what gets left out, and that is a problem. There's no question about that. Nothing springs to mind. And then again, how do we connect more closely with our IT colleagues? Because I think we need to be connected. We just want to avoid being taken over by them. And I think that is a very real likelihood unless we get involved, get in bed with them. Okay, so I just put this at the end. This is a University of Melbourne job, a research data, an institution with a very huge amounts of research data. It's one of possibly the #1 university in Australia. Look at this job ad. For those of us who are on faculty teaching people, do you think one of your students could come out and fit that demand? Yeah, that's a ridiculous requirement, I think, because I don't think there'd be anybody that could do all that. But at the same time, it does make you think, hey, if I can do all that, I could get a job anywhere, I'm sure. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? If people are asking for that, then us who's devising courses need to make sure that we can supply people who've got at least some of those skills. And I'm sure we can do some. Finally, okay, big data is a real challenge for the information professions, but it can be an opportunity. This is a new field and we should be in on the ground floor because we do have expertise in information management. There is a natural affinity, I believe, across the cultural heritage sectors, and we should be able to work together, link with IT, link with business, and come up with our own designs, our own solutions to some of these problems. Cooperation is the key, there's no question about it, because if we don't cooperate, I think we're too small in all our professions to have any great influence. If we can cooperate more strongly, we've got some leverage, we can actually change things. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have 5 minutes for questions. Any questions for Bob? Anna Maria?
It's a comment and a question. I think that it's very good that we have anticipated the Giovanni Michetti presentation because your presentations are very specular. And so, Giovanni said in the digital era, nothing changed. You have demonstrated that there is a lot of change. And so the question is, the consequence and the question is, this means that we need to have another profile for data curation. It's a new job. Occasionally some cultural heritage professional can be recycled, but because they don't want to change in digital area. Instead, there is the need of this profession. For me, the consequence is that we need a new profile.
I think it's not quite as black and white as I don't think. I think somebody said this morning, because I wrote it down, technology is the instrument to improve our services and not replace them. And I think that's one of the things. Okay, there is change because of big data, and it's something we didn't have before. And now all of a sudden, so the traditional tools we have of cataloguing or description, arrangement and description and things like that don't work with big data because it's a new format, essentially. But the actual principles, we still want to make it, preserve it, we still want to make it accessible, we still want to be useful to our users in managing it, all that sort of stuff. I think, they're the underlining it all, aren't they? And that's why it's important, I think, for us to still be involved and not hand it all over to IT and walk away.
May just add that I didn't say that nothing changed. I just wanted to highlight that the functions, you can still call the functions the same as he was saying. I mean, we are still describing, we are still managing, we are still preserving it, but he's right. I mean, you cannot describe big data the same way you can do with a traditional holding, of course, but we still call it description. So you need different techniques. but the methodology and the goal is the same to me. This is, I mean, the approach. Just to clarify,
Hi.
thank you.
Very short. I'm Federica Riva. I'm working with music, and I would like to ask to the. Do you think there is any relationship between the big data treatment and the amount of cultural heritage and the quality of cultural heritage you have in a country? Because, for example, Italy is very well known to have big data in cultural heritage. So our big data is very old big data. So how can we put together electronic big data and the big amount of ancient things we have?
I think it's going to cost you more than many other people. Because really, if the big data is what you're going to digitize, isn't it? So the programs you've got are going to go on for a long, long time. You know, whether it's museums, archaeology, whether it's records in the, in the various, the sorts of things somebody was talking about this morning, the 9th century documents and things like that. You can't stick those on a machine, obviously, and just get them digitized, dunk, 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 dunk. Because they're too fragile. So it's going to take a lot longer and it's going to cost you a lot more. I think that's the answer. And that's why you need cooperation European-wide, so that some of the, some other countries can help out, that sort of stuff, share the load.
Okay. Thank you very much. And let me introduce our third speaker, Cristina Patuelli, who is an associate professor at the School of Information and Library Science at Pratt Institute in New York. Cristina teaches their courses in knowledge organization, cultural heritage, and human information behavior. Her current research explores the intersection between cultural heritage, information access, description, and design, so you almost cover everything. And she's the director of the Linked project, which is an investigation of the application of linked open data into cultural heritage resources, and I believe she mentions this project in her paper and hopefully in the presentation. She is a recipient of several research awards, including OCLC, ALISE Library and Information Science Research Grant, the American Library Association, Carol Preston Rubber Research Grant. So, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina, for the kind introduction. So at this time of the day, probably we are all a little bit tired, so I will try to be lightweight. Let's say. My angle is slightly different. I'm going to talk about the making of a community, talk about LODLAM, that stands for Linked Open Data for Libraries, Archives, and Museums, which is an international community of information professionals, researchers, academics, educators, engaged in implementing linked open data technology applied primarily to digital cultural heritage. So I will give the overview will be the context in which this community has emerged, a little bit of its development, and very quickly through its future. So LODLAM is driven by the vision of linked open data, and the linked open data paradigm itself has served as a conceptual framework, the catalyst somehow for building this community. So let's start by having a quick look at the linked open data paradigm. The most common definition of LOD is it's a set of principles and methods to publish structured information, structured data on the web in ways that make this data human and machine readable, interlinkable, and open to novel and enhanced uses. LOD is based on a small set of standards. Basically, LOD technology turns bits of information, discrete units of information, it could be data, it could be metadata, into human and machine readable and processable data through a number of conventions, not many actually, two main conventions. One is a transfer protocol, HTTP, that we all know, and the other one is a naming convention, URI, Uniform Resource Identifier, a global identifier similar to URL. Actually, is a type of URL is a type of URI. So two simple web standards that really we all are familiar with. The main component of LOD is RDF, Resource Description Framework, which is the data model, the unified model for describing these pieces of information. And when I say pieces of information, units, I mean data, metadata. In linked open data jargon, it would be simply things, anything that can be identified with an URI and showed, display through the HTTP protocol, a hyperlink. And these things could be events, people, places, concepts, themes, topics. And so RDF provides this unified model for describing, for representing these things, for representing their relationships, and in a way that provides a simple grammar, something like this. Statements made up of subject, predicate, object. Anything can be represented and described through this simple statement. Subject, predicate, and objects. Obviously, it's a statement made up of 3 components, and it's also called triple. So you will hear more and more of RDF triples, something that allows us to say France is capital of Paris. If we then assign a URI, an identifier to each bit of information, then we webify this statement. We turn this statement into something that can be processed on the web. So we are all familiar with the tabular organization structure of data in our databases, property value structures. Well, we take this information and we make it into linked data. So when the information is transformed and structured this way, then it becomes accessible seamlessly on the web. So another way of looking at this is thinking of linked open data as a framework for linking these pieces of information that can come from different and heterogeneous sources. It could be libraries, it could be archives, it could be museums, but it also could be Wikipedia. It can also could be geonames. It could also be government data. So a wide variety of data sets. So linking these pieces of information across the web, making it possible to create this meaningful, where can I, doesn't work, but in any case, you see, sorry? I don't think so. No, it doesn't matter. Well, this is really important, the power of linked data. These links that you see are not implicit, they express meaning, they have labels. These make possible to give meaning to the association of information, but to also create new paths to discovery, new ways of interpreting things. And so you see through this framework, this is a very trivial visualization, the possibility of convergence. Well, this kind of paradigm also contributes to, well, in our field, in particular in library science, in librarianship, to the deconstruction of the record. So we are gradually seeing a shift from an approach that is document-centric towards data-centric. Linked open data is all about these small units of information. And the blurring of the boundaries between data and metadata, because when you give meaning to these pieces of information, they become metadata. There is no more sense in making this distinction. And then the shift towards a different structure from the tree structure we are familiar with through hierarchies, or if we think of XML files, towards a graph network structure. And also, before there was the discussion, Patricia brought up the idea of collaboration and coordination. Well, in the linked open data environment, you can perform collaboration without the need of coordination, because we all work with a common model that unifies the different practices. So we don't have to agree upon a specific standard. We can use our tradition and our practices. Is just the model, the overarching model, the RDF that unifies all the different practices. So the law paradigm is characterized from the linking capability, but is also open, and this is a very strong aspect, because the openness in this case means it uses open standards, as we saw, HTTP, RDF, URIs, but is also making this information, this data, openly available on the web in a way that they can be searched seamlessly on the web. They can be queried, they can be aggregated, they can be navigated and visualized on the web. So, in other words, the web becomes our discovery space and is a way of thinking of our cultural heritage or our descriptions, not as semantic, as descriptions locked into our, well, we hear the word silos many times, but not locked within these walled gardens of our institutions, but openly available and reusable. Another key point of linked open data is reusability. The semantics is out there and can be reused. It can be shared. It is. It's not, I'm saying can as something that has a perspective in the future. It is reused and shared. And this obviously facilitates interoperability. It helps to overcome this locked situation. So this is the vision behind LODLAM, and this community is still very novel, but rapidly evolving, so it's probably early to classify it or to try to capture its complexity, but we can just start to identify a few traits, and actually LODLAM shares most of the traits of the paradigm, the linked open data paradigm that they are trying to implement. It is open, it is distributed, diverse, and self-organized. So it stems from the open source culture, as advocated by Aaron Swartz, that I always love to put on my slides as a tribute to this, one of the brightest minds in web development that we all miss dearly. And he was an open source activist, and he was the mind behind the development of the RDF model as we know it, and the precursor of linked open data. Probably you are all familiar with the Internet Archive, which is a non-profit digital library which supports universal access to all knowledge and permanent storage. It's set in San Francisco. It's now the place where communities, institutions, private citizens can archive their own materials with the perspective to have these materials available freely in perpetuity. And here we see Brewster Kahle, who is the founder of the Digital Archive, and this is a picture taken from the first Lord Lamb Summit, and they hosted us in 2011. So the common goal that bound the community is the idea to open up content and data from institutions of any type. And so one of the mantras is free your metadata, make your metadata available, or as Tim Berners-Lee says, stop hugging your data. So this community, obviously, as we all know, and we discuss most of the day, brings different traditions, diverse traditions, descriptive practices, but it is this LOD framework that is able to provide a layers, a semantic layer above our practices, above our records and our way of describing resources in a way that convergence is enabled and the data can interoperate. So it's a convergence that is not just a goal, is a practice through this methodology. And the community is itself extremely diverse. So you have the presence of people from any kind of organization in the cultural domain, and the project that participates or they bring to the table can be from the large scale. Australia is largely represented with Ingrid Mason, who is one of the promoters of Lord Lamb, British Museum, Smithsonian, through the more small-scale, independent, experimental research project. This community is kind of self-organized. The way it grew, it started, is just by getting together through the first symposium in 2011 in San Francisco. John Voss, I have 7 minutes, okay, I'm gonna go fast. John Voss has been the force, the engine behind all them to put these people together. And I remember when I went, it was the first time I participated in a non-conference because the format of this symposium was very horizontal, very different from the traditional structure of a conference. And it was based on actual interest of participants. So what you needed in those 2 days was ideas, an easel, a board where to put topics, and people would flock around these easels. And I couldn't believe it because, how do these self-organized things work? It worked beautifully. It created glue. People started to discuss the topics that they care about. So basically starting from the idea, what questions are we trying to answer practically? And the idea that you were free to move from one table to another and following the conversation that you thought were most interesting, or starting the conversations. So a couple of things. One thing to take away, at least from that first experience, was start small, but start. So the culture that emerged, and I feel it, I tend to be very abstract, and very abstract, and I like theory. This is my training, philosophy, this kind of, and I embrace this culture, the culture of experimentation, mash-up approach. Do stuff, prototype, pilot, make mistakes, get your hands dirty, but learn by doing, and share what you learn. And so the second summit in 2013 was more and more financial support from Europeana, DPLA, and various organizations, but also was the time, the reality check, when the discussion was focused on the use cases, what are the projects that show the benefits and the potential of this technology, what are the mistakes we are making, and one of the initiatives, well, the selling point of the initiative was sort of competition, the LogLab challenge that showcased 5 nominated projects that were representative of the production of linked open data in library archives and museums. Well, yeah. They are somehow all Europeans, because the first one from Belgium, the free metadata guys, then the second one is from Bologna and Roma, Regesta, and the Institute of Cultural Heritage, and third one is mine, is developed in New York, but I think there is, there is a collaboration, American Italians. Anyway, very last slide. What's going on? Well, this movement continues to evolve through regional meetings, training events, cross-domain workshop. There are workshops where you try to put together computer scientists and digital humanists, platforms like the website, the blog, the Twitter, and then the next LogLab would be in Sydney in 2015. So we'll see what happens. We didn't even know that there would be another summit in 2013, and here we are, and things are growing, and so it's an exciting moment, and that's all. Thank you.
Christina, thank you very much for your presentation. We have 5 minutes for questions, so floor is yours. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to start in this case. In your paper, you mentioned that the projects that are being developed in linked open data in cultural heritage institutions are primarily kind of an experimental research phase or pilot phase. What would it take to take this experimentation into a more broader implementation of linked data in libraries, archives, and museums?
Critical mass.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think we are going through phases. The first one was to create linked data. So you need those bubbles, those data set of linked data before you make the data linkable. And so you have all these islands of data, and you need, well, what do you need? Most of these projects are already workable projects. Probably naturally, islands would converge. You know what we need? We need tools for the people to use, because the data is there. We are working, it's part of the discussion to think of the user side, to have interfaces that allow people to query the data, because the data is there. You go to the British Museum, there is the whole collection of records of the British Museum is there to use. So what does it mean? That implementers, developers can take the data set and can mesh up with their data set. We do it all the time. Or the users can query this data set. The interfaces are terrible. But no, it's a very young movement. There is a lot to do, and no, it will grow, or the issues will be addressed. We will learn something in any way. And compared to the semantic web, because this is basically the new wave, the implementation of the semantic web, compared to the semantic web, this methodology is less ambitious, is more lower barrier, So we need more people. We prepare every semester those of new students who are programming, doing stuff, so we'll see.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, in this case, please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.